Live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's special edition of CovInspiration with Dayo Israel. Today, I have on the show a very good friend of mine, someone I will consider a brother, as a pride of the old Caribbean continent or subcontinent, the ambassador of Barbados to the World Trade Organization, the UN in Geneva, and other international organizations. He's also the chairman of the CTE at the WTO. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Chad Blackman. Ambassador Blackman, it's so good to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you again, Dayo, in a obviously different dispensation. I'm glad that you mentioned or you stated that the Caribbean was a continent and then you said subcontinent. I mean, we're neither. We're a group of countries and islands, but you know, we make our mark on the international stage. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. I think let me start from the root. How is coronavirus eating your own country and the subcontinent or the Caribbean island?
Okay. No, that's fine. Well, first of all, let me put it this way. From the health point of view, our numbers in the English-speaking Caribbean have not been as bad as other regions in the world, but there has been some concern. Remember, in relative terms, we have smaller populations. So when you look at the numbers and you put that into the context of the population sizes, there was a bit of concern, or there is a bit of concern. But the countries, by and large, in the Caribbean have been able to manage it well from a health perspective. And credit must be given to a number of countries in the Caribbean for doing so. Surely, from Barbados' perspective, our government under our leadership of Prime Minister Motley took a very early decision with regard to how are we going to treat to this pandemic. And at the time, it wasn't a pandemic. It was simply a warning of the disease on the horizon. But decisive leadership really protected us in a number of areas. Now, in regards to the impact economically, that's a different scenario.
I was going to come to that, actually.
Yeah, the majority of countries in the Caribbean are predominantly driven by tourism. We have fantastic beaches, we have excellent resorts, facilities, nature, you name it. And because of the virus and the pandemic, and as a result of there not being no flights in the world, there's been limited and restriction of movement of people, automatically, at a moment's notice, our tourism sector in the Caribbean has come to a grinding halt. Now, the implications of that and the impact of that has been significant because the tourism sector, for example, in Barbados and a number of other countries in the Caribbean, is the leading sector and driver of the economy, which invariably brings in critical foreign exchange that the country needs in order to pay its bills, to survive, and to grow. We've seen in a very short time, therefore, the number of persons working in those sectors as a result of having to be laid off because the hotels are not open. The services that also support the hotel industry and the tourism industry, namely the food and beverage sectors, the different areas, they've also had to reduce their capacity because there's now a lesser demand for those goods and services. And then fourthly, because of the sharp increase in unemployment for this period, the National Insurance Service, and what some countries would call their social security system, has had a high number of claims in terms of trying to access that facility in order to be able to survive. So this has all happened in a few months. And to put it into further context, as I said, we're small open economies. So the population of Barbados, as strong a country as we are, we're only 290,000 people. Some countries in the Caribbean have 1 million, some have 1.5 million or 2, depending. But they too have been hit. So let's take, for example, the oil prices. The oil prices have come to an increasing low. And I'm sure you know this very well because you're in Nigeria. But in the Caribbean, one of our countries, for example, Trinidad and Tobago, is a major producer of petroleum goods and services. So because of the low price being now seen in the global market, countries who are led by petroleum economies, as it were, are also seeing an impact as a result of the lesser demand taking place across the world. So there's a complete shift in terms of what's taking place in the region, and we're now having to face, in very serious terms, an unprecedented pandemic, not just, as I said, in terms of health, but the economy and the overall society has been hit.
And bearing that in mind, how is this affecting education on the Caribbean island?
Well,
and what are the alternatives?
Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting question you ask. It is hitting the region in a very significant way. Fortunately for Barbados, in some respects, we have not had to endure it in the same way as others have, not just in the region, but across the world. What are some of the issues? Now, up to this point, by and large, tuition was delivered in primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions, by and large, on a face-to-face basis. And now you've then had to move your students into the virtual world of teaching, which is always a very good thing in terms of enhancing your technology prospects. But there are some gaps because not every family, for example, may have access to a device, whether that be a tablet or a laptop. Yes. Absolutely. Some families across the region may not have access to, as simple as it is, internet. They may have internet on their phone, but they may not necessarily have the Wi-Fi in their house, which you really need that good bandwidth to be able to access the facilities. And then fourthly, and importantly, it's one thing to assist your child in homework on evenings. It's another thing when you're at home and having to, for every day for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, almost now become the teacher in addition to the teacher who's now teaching all day remotely. So there are a number of challenges that have to be addressed, and these have had to be addressed. But I think the authorities in Barbados, particularly in the region, have been trying their best to really leverage. But, and I will get to this further in the discussion. One of the things I want to say to you, Dayo, and to your audience, is that, as I've said here in Geneva, and I've said across the board, that this pandemic, notwithstanding that it has proven to be difficult, notwithstanding that it has proven to be tough, notwithstanding that it has forced us to do things in ways that we never thought we would have to do in 2020, because I'm sure this is not the 2020 that the world envisioned. But I always say, you should never waste a good crisis. And I truly believe that this pandemic and this crisis, coronavirus, COVID-19, presents the singular opportunity for the developing world to, for the first time in a very long time, if ever, to chart a course forward for themselves as a developing world in a way that is sustainable, in a way that builds resilience, and in a way that also offers security. And by security, I don't necessarily just mean physical security, but for security in all other areas for our countries, both on individual levels as countries and as a collective. Now is the time for our young people in Africa, the young people in the Caribbean, the young people in the Pacific, in the world, to reimagine the world that is sustainable. But the question is, how are we going to do that? What resources are needed to really kickstart a new frontier of growth and development that prepares us in the future for the future? Now, let's be frank. Pandemics will come, pandemics will go. Hurricanes will come, hurricanes will go. Economic crises will come, economic crises will go. But the constant in those three, amongst other things, is that external shocks will come. So we know that they will come. We don't know in what form they will manifest and they will come. And we don't know when they will come, but we know that they will come. So therefore, our economies now have to be built in a way that is resilient, forward-looking. And this pandemic has also presented with a very clear picture, a level of internal, I don't want to say closing our perspectives, but notwithstanding that we trade, it also has to be a situation where we are in a capacity to provide the necessary goods and services that we need during times like this. So for example, intellectual property has to now be the thing. We have to get our young people and professionals in our regions and continents to be thinking, what demand is there? What can I invent with my mind? What can I conceive mentally that I can take it from idea to implementation, and also protect it via intellectual property. So in terms of your local intellectual property office, and then ultimately at the World Intellectual Property Office here in Geneva, which protects your creation, your intellectual thought, because there is finance and business to be accrued in doing so. So take a very simple example. We are in the pandemic right now. One of the major things needed are ventilators. By and large, our regions and our countries are not in the business of making those things, but they're needed. So we have to then take our critical foreign exchange, use that to supply that need. But equally, there's nothing stopping us, by and large, from having that sort of thinking that we should be able to supply that on a large scale for our own. So I think that this has come at a very good time, particularly for you guys in Africa, in the continent. You've now established the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
Agreement.
Agreement, okay? And you now have, by and large, the largest trading bloc in the world. You are a continent filled, and I repeat, filled with resources of all kinds. Of all kinds. And hitherto, it has been a situation where a lot of the resources that are coming from the continent, the African continent, are then taken in their raw form and exported, not for their highest premium or highest value, externally. The time has long passed, but equally, now that we're in this opportunity, and that's what I like to call it, the time has now come where those resources ought to be placed into a high-level value chain. So made in Africa, by Africa, for the world. And that's a critical thing. Not made in Africa, by Africa, only for Africa, but made in Africa, by Africa, for the world. So therefore, I expect to see, honestly, a high level of goods and services of premium quality being made in the continent and on the continent for the continent to use and to have access to at reasonable and affordable prices using the mechanism of your new free trade agreement, but for the world to consume. Who then will get the benefits of that foreign exchange coming in? The continent. And then what you do with that resource coming in then is another matter. So you have to prepare. But now is the time for the continent to really establish itself forever as the bedrock of the global trading system in terms of a region. If there's any one region in my mind, based on the resources and capacity, the resources that you have and the capacity that you could have, now is it. But it takes a very coordinated and structured way to do that.
That's excellent, Ambassador. One of the things I was also going to ask, before we come back again to Africa, let's go back quickly to the Caribbean. Does the relative smallness of the
I'm not hearing you. You said there's the relative smallness of the...
Yes, does the relative smallness of the population in small island developing states place them at an advantage position during this pandemic? So the small island developing state like in the Caribbean, does the size play an advantage in this COVID season? Does it mean that they can manage the pandemic better? You know, are there advantages to this?
True. There are pros and there are cons. And I'd answer this in two ways. Let's list the pros. Now, as you said, we're small in terms of population, we're small in terms of geographical size. So therefore, in order to, the coverage of landmass and population that you would have to treat to would not be the same as, for example, a country in continental Africa. Okay, that's fine. So in that regard, there are advantages. The flip side, in dealing more with the cons, is that as small island developing states, the number of issues, not just in terms of size now, that size also comes with limited capacity. We import, by and large, everything that we consume, whether it be a good or different types of services, okay? That's foreign exchange that we have to look for. A number of Caribbean countries, even before the pandemic, were already crippled with high levels of debt. And it's not debt because necessarily there's situations of bad management, as it were, but a number of our countries have had to, year after year, treat to the issues of natural disasters. And when natural disasters come, there's only so much foreign aid that will help you. You then obviously then have to go to the international market and borrow on the international market, and therefore you carry up your level of debt even further. And for us, climate change is a very real thing. Hurricanes come into the Caribbean every single year. It's a new reality for us. So then you then start to see countries who are small, they're highly vulnerable. And that vulnerability, and that's why my Prime Minister, when she was speaking to Christiane Amanpour some 2 weeks ago on CNN, made a very clear call that in this new era, even before the pandemic, she was saying it, there needs to be a vulnerability index in which the world can measure and countries can measure their capacity to do business, to borrow on the international market for concessional financing for grants. And this is the issue relative to SIDS. I'm very, very glad you asked this. A number of SIDS, and a high number of them actually, are considered on the World Bank, the measurement, as high income and medium income countries. Simply put, you look at the size of the economy, you divide it by the population, and that determines where on the ranking you are. Now, Barbados is one such country. We are classified as a high income country by World Bank standard. And once you fall into that bracket or medium income, notwithstanding your small population size, your inability to have access to a deep pocket, as it were, you are told, well, you are classified as high income. You can't borrow at certain rates, or you can't get grant money at or concessional financing because you are classified as income. And we have called equally for a long time, and here in Geneva, in forums such as UNCTAD, and the same World Bank, that classification of high income GDP per capita criteria alone as a measure of a country's capacity ought not to be the sole mechanism to do so. That model is long outdated. And these issues then present a very real challenge for small island developing states. Incidentally, I am the coordinator / chair of the SIDS group of ambassadors here in Geneva. And it's one of the issues that we have touted for a very, very, very long time. And recently, since the COVID-19 has started, it is one of the front burner issues that we have also treated to, because the international community, particularly the international financial community, has to come to the real understanding that small island developing states have a peculiar set of realities. And that's why we said we're vulnerable. Now, Barbados is slated to host UNCTAD 15, which is the 15th conference of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. It happens every 4 years, and it's the conference that deals with all issues of trade and all issues of development within the UN system. Barbados is going to be the host. Now, we were supposed to host in October of this year, but because of the pandemic, we've had to then push it back to next year at a date to be decided. But at that conference, it will be front and center all of the issues that we're talking about. And incidentally, even before the pandemic had happened, our country had proposed to the membership that the theme for this conference is from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. I'll repeat that again, from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. And you couldn't ask for a better theme for a conference that deals with all issues of trade and development globally. Why? Who would have thought that in May 2020, countries who have large GDPs, very wealthy developed countries, are faced with very tough realities with regards to their economies, health systems, and also sometimes in many respects, a lack of supplies for their own people. Everyone is vulnerable. We're all vulnerable at different levels, but we're all vulnerable. We're all striving to become equal. So there are varying levels of inequalities. But this pandemic has shown that all of us, large, small, coastal, landlocked, doesn't matter. Every country is vulnerable. And we have to put in place in the international multilateral system a framework that is sound, comprehensive, forward-looking, and allows for us to really prepare as we go forward.
So I read an article last month that said Mother Earth has been rejoicing during the coronavirus restriction on human movement and activities, stating clearly that the reduction in human activities has also reduced climate change. What is your opinion on this?
You broke up. I was trying to get you, but you broke up there.
Yes, that Mother Earth is rejoicing and happy with the coronavirus restriction on human activities, What do you think? It's technically that the reduction in human activities has also reduced climate change. What is your opinion on this?
It's a very timely question. I'd say this, and I hope your audience would also catch this as well. As recent as this morning, I had a meeting with the International Trade and Environment Community here in Geneva under the ambit of the WTO and the Geneva Environmental Network. And one of the things that I said to them was that within a few months, okay, COVID-19, with its unintended consequence, has been able to do, by and large, for the environment, more than a number of meetings and conferences and lobbies and everything have been able to achieve in a number of years. Okay, let's be honest. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that we have to put our hands up in the air and say that, let's hope for the best. We now have to use the opportunity to ensure that as we come out of this pandemic, that we don't, whilst trying to restart the domestic economies and the global economies, that we retard the progress that we would have seen over the last coming months in terms of a number of things in the environment. This is particularly important. And it therefore behoves us to ensure that as we create a new, strong global economy, that it is sustainable. What has this pandemic shown, Dayo? So normally, if you wanted to have a meeting, a prolonged meeting, for example, both you and I would fly to a country or London or New York, and we would have meetings and everything. Okay, we would our carbon footprint by virtue of flying would be heavy. I'm not saying we must stop flying, of course not, that's not practical. But the point I'm saying is every institution or most institutions in the world, businesses, companies, governments have been able to get on with the work, albeit sometimes on a reduced basis, but using the technology. And it therefore says that as we go forward, we don't necessarily have to go back to the model that we were using. There can be a variation of how we do these things. And the issue of technology has to be at the core of what we do. Now, how do you address that? Because as I said, like in the Caribbean, some countries are facing capacity constraints with access to technology. I'm sure it's the same thing with Africa. I'm sure it's the same thing also here in Europe. It's not just a Caribbean and African thing. There are pockets of communities who don't have access to sound good technology. So there also has to be a capacity building mechanism that allows for us to do this. But in terms of the impact on the environment, the opportunities are there. It's clear. I'm sure we've all seen the memes on social media where allegedly, I don't know, the canals in Italy, you see animals and fish that you haven't seen before. Yeah. I don't know how true, but the point is the message is out there that the environment, as you rightly said, has been able to breathe. So as we go forward and we reignite the global economy, we have to do so in a framework that allows for there to be sustainable development. And that's why, importantly, countries must never now retreat from the multilateral system. We must now stay together in the WTO. We must now stay together in the UN and try to address these issues, not as single sovereign states, but as a collective global community with the implementation as sovereign states. And that has to be clear as we go forward.
Ambassador, thank you so much for that input. I want to speak to you about young people in global policy making. When I say young people, I mean under 45. But before I get into that, because you were a good example for people in Nigeria to say, look at how great you are able to represent the interest of your country, even from when you were younger than this, at the Commonwealth and at various other platforms. And we have this major Not Too Young to Run movement in Africa. But before I get to that, I want to ask, I want to conclude my questions on trade policies. What trade policies are you aware that have been put in place, or do you think should be put in place to assist the recovery of the global economy after COVID-19?
Thank you. First of all, let me say a number of countries right now are going through their own domestic challenges. And by that, I mean, as a result of what's going on, they're having issues with their supply chains. A lot of countries are now even limiting their own populations when they go to the supermarket and the amount of food that they can purchase in terms of certain categories. But from a policy perspective, one of the things that has been clear, and Barbados is a signatory to what I'm about to propose, a number of countries, as a result of some other countries placing export restrictions on certain goods that are needed in other countries. Because remember, it's an open global economy. You have a good that I need, I import it from you. Because of the pandemic, we've now seen, in many respects, some countries placing restrictions on certain goods that can be exported. And Barbados has been one of the countries who joined a statement led by Switzerland last week. I think it was, last week. And we said, along with a number of other countries, including Canada, etc., that now is not the time for there to be a retreat and restrictions relative to trade. Trade will be the one thing, or one of the few things that will help us to get out of this reality. We need to trade with each other. And going forward in the multilateral system, trade policies now have to be very pandemic focused. And by that, we have to now look at all the policies, not just trade, but all of the policies that we now adopt. We have to look at it through a green perspective and a feasibility / capacity perspective. How are we going to be able to ensure that whatever policies we have in place can withstand any external shock? And it goes back to what I said to you before. That will be the hallmark of good policy making going forward. And you know, it's there. Now, there are a number of things that have been done in the UN, led by the Secretary General in New York, for there to be a lot of resources, or as much resources as possible, for a number of countries to be able to tap into that, to be able to help their countries to respond to COVID, whether it be from a health perspective, economic perspective, capacity building, you name it. So there are things happening. But I also think that there needs to be a global conversation, and soon, amongst world leaders, amongst the private sector, collectively together, on how are we going to move forward in a sustainable way? How are we going to move forward in a way that's not going to harm the environment? How are we going to move forward in a way that does not disrupt our supply chain? How are we going to move forward in a way that countries with excellent resources are not just the supplier of those resources, but are true beneficiaries of the benefits of the resources at the high end? These are things and conversations that need to be had. So now is the time for real conversation. And I really must say, before we go on, Dayo, that I applaud you for the initiative that you've taken here in bringing these sorts of global conversations to your audience, not just to Nigerians, but because I know you have a very large global audience. These are the sorts of conversations that need to be had, because now is the time to move forward. If you go back in history, every time there was a major global challenge, and pandemic particularly, the next 50 years after that, you saw a surge in development in different ways. But the countries who enjoyed the development most were the countries who took the time during the tough times and the pandemic to prepare, to reimagine the world. Now, I'm not going to pretend that a number of our developing countries are resource constrained. Let's face it. We have to find ingenuitive ways to overcome that. Let's face it, when it comes to culture and the cultural industries, and I make this not as a boast, but just stating a fact, the Caribbean, Africa, are right up there. The question is, how do we turn our way of life, or the way we speak, the way we dress, our music, the excellent way that we handle our business in terms of sport, for example? How do we turn that natural skill set into a comprehensive source of revenue, not for a few or one or two people, but an entire nation and an entire region, backed by sound business principles? These are some of the things that we have to use this opportunity to think about, you see? So it's not just responding to COVID-19 and, okay, the virus goes away or it doesn't go away, but it's there for another 2 or 3 years. No. This is now ground zero for all of us. But the question is, who's prepared to want it more as a country and as a region?
Before I go into the direction that I was talking about, you have very strong knowledge in intellectual property. What do you think that African innovators, inventors should be thinking about, should be aware of when it comes to intellectual property right, and how should they protect themselves? I just thought that I'll take advantage of the fact that I have you right here for them to be able to learn from you.
Well, no worries at all. It's my pleasure. I would simply say this. First of all, it comes from a level of self-belief. I think once our persons can have an inherent belief of self, anything is possible. Everything is possible. All ideas must contend. Okay. Now, everything that we do, we must now look at it from the position of, can I turn my idea into a commodity? Can I turn my idea into a financial resource? Whatever the idea is. And if you think you can, then it means that you should. Thirdly, and importantly, we have to now have an understanding of trying to understand, how do I take that idea that has economic value, not just here in Nigeria or in Geneva or Switzerland, wherever you are, but to protect it. So the first thing that you should do is try to go to your local corporate affairs office, whether it's regionally or nationally, whatever, and protect that idea. Now, for those who don't have the resources to do that, for example, because every country is not the same, young lawyers in the region who are coming out of graduate school in Nigeria, I know you have a number of law schools there, should be setting up frameworks. And these are the things that young advocates ought to be doing. Set up frameworks where there are young legal professionals fresh out of law school who, for a period of time, pro bono, as part of their contribution to give back to society, on behalf of young inventors and persons who have intellectual property, brilliant ideas, help them and walk them through the processes and channels of how to protect your intellectual property. That's the first thing. Because let's be fair, so everyone doesn't have the resources to go and pay a lawyer to walk you through that process. But there should be a level of giving back, because remember, the greater good is that your country and region will benefit from the finances that will be accrued over time of that intellectual property. So it requires of us now thinking in a very big and comprehensive way. And then on the big stage, world intellectual property. Protect your intellectual property. Very basic thing that people used to do and they still do. If you have something, if you have a business idea, okay, and you shared it with someone, not as visible, a very simple thing that you can do, you take that business idea, write it down, you date it, you get an envelope, and you post it to yourself. Okay, post it to yourself, because remember, when you receive the mail, it has on like these little lines and the date and everything, so that should a dispute arise and someone has your idea, you then open it in the court before the judge, and they can see, okay, yes, this was not open, it was sealed and everything. So there are different ways that you can do it. So I've given you the thorough way, and also in the short term, one of the things that you can do to protect yourself. But this will be critical. This will be critical. Because as I said, in the world right now, we live in a world of data. We live in a world of artificial intelligence and technology. The new money, the new resources is the resources in the mind and also data. And who controls that will be ahead of the curve for a very, very long time, if not forever.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Now, let me go into the core part that I want to wrap up with today before we let you go, and that's about young people in leadership. I wouldn't want to discuss your age, life on television, but I want to believe that from what I know, or we've been friends for over, if not 10 years or more, that you became ambassador perhaps under 40.
Yes. I became ambassador at the age of 35.
At the age of 35. Now, that is rare in Africa. It's not just an ambassador, like I was saying in the broadcast. It's not a certificate award ambassador. I'm talking about an ambassador of a country to another country, in particular to the United Nations. What lesson do you think that your story teaches us in Africa?
I'll tell you this quite simply. First, what the story has taught me is that, with Jesus, every single thing is possible, my friend. Everything. And I have always been a person who has been driven by serving my country in different forms. As you know, from the years where we were youth ambassadors and we came up in the global youth ambassadors movement. From then, we had a passion for ensuring that our countries and regions were represented. But also, do not let your circumstance determine your outcome and future. For those of you who are listening, I'm an ambassador now, but I wasn't born into a rich family at all. At all. by any stretch of any imagination. So persons mustn't believe that these positions and things are necessarily only for persons who come from wealth. One of the things that got me here was that I had parents who were very determined that their circumstance should not be my circumstance in the future, and they placed a very high premium on education. Now, luckily for me and many other Barbadians, education in Barbados is free from nursery right to tertiary. Okay, but the question is, how do you take advantage of that? And education, in terms of the formal sense, isn't all. You, in this modern age, it's not just about having a law degree or a degree in medicine. It's who has, as I said, the idea. And young people ought now to see, let's take this forward. I am young, so what? But be prepared. Be well prepared, be well researched, know your ideas, and you have to be able to take criticism as well. That's another thing. Everyone is not going to be for you. But equally, if you're convicted and grounded firmly, and I really emphasize firmly, with what you believe and with what you are presenting to the table, the opportunities will come. And that is really what I want to say. As I said to you, to be appointed ambassador to the United Nations at the age of 35, some 2 years ago. Well, now I've obviously given up my age, which is fine. Has been a very humbling experience, but to whom much is given, much is expected.
Much is expected.
So it's one thing to say, okay, I'm the youngest ambassador in my country's hand. Okay, what have you done with that? What are you doing for your country? How are you raising your country's profile? How are you helping other countries in the region to advance? How are you helping other countries in the world through your chairmanship, for example, in the WTO, to reach their own objectives? So it's not just about me. It's not just about Barbados. By virtue of being here in Geneva and taking out a number of the global chairmanships that I have, I'm invariably now serving the world. And it's a very humbling thing. And as I said, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I really look forward to seeing the young people in Africa stake their claim on the world, not just on Africa, not just in pockets in terms of music. So yes, you have the Whiz Kids and the Davidos and Burna Boys. Lovely. I love Burna Boy.
Hey.
Okay.
You know how the Nigerian musician.
Of course, the African giant, and that's where in my downtime when I'm or sometimes even when I'm writing speeches, I put on some Burna Boy. But that's another discussion for another day. The point I'm making is Africa is more than music. Africa is more than sport. It's those things. But Africa has a global historical duty, one to itself and to the world, to do well. You have some of the oldest universities on earth, okay? And this is, perhaps you need to bring back another time, Dayo, because there's other things that I want to touch on. But one of the things I want to leave with your audience is the fact that there has to be new premium placed on Africa, brand Africa, image Africa, conscious Africa. That Africa is more than a destination and a landmass. It's a consciousness. It's really a civilization, okay? And now, during this pandemic, countries in Africa have to now see themselves as leading the world out of many of our challenges. And one of the things that I want to see is the fact that a number of our countries ought to be going to African universities. So we place high premium on going to the US or Europe to study. Fine. I've studied law in Europe. Okay. But we now have to also yes, Essex University.
Essex University. I think this is a good place to advertise Essex.
there you go. And I must say, on their credit, they have the #1 human rights law program on earth, by the way. But the point is this. If we place greater premium on our universities in the Caribbean and in Africa, and we have our young people going and cross-fertilization of that, the demand, see, universities get their prestige based on demand. If we create a demand for our own resources, then by and large, it happens. And then you start to see the inward flows of resources that come with it. So I'm saying we have to reimagine the world as we want it. The rest of the world doesn't have the world that they have because it just fell out the sky. They imagined it, and then successive generations built upon that idea into reality. This is what has to happen now during this time.
Ambassador, what do you think is the benefit of young people in leadership to their nation state? And what is the advantage of having young people play critical role in global development? Kofi Annan said, young people must be at the forefront of global change. But what we find in Africa is successive years of hegemony by the older generation who have refused to turn in power to the younger generation. And what role did mentorship play? Did you have to have a special experience before you? Because it is very rare that an African country would appoint someone of that age range as an ambassador to organizations such as the United Nations. We have countries that have ambassadors even to United States or other countries as old as 82 years old, 86 years old, 70 something years old. Um, is there is there something they're missing by not having younger blood like yourself? And also, for you, for example, was there anything special? Or because, like I said, in Africa, you would not see this kind of the thing that you must be old to be wise. What is your comment on that? Yes.
Yeah, no. Thank you for the question. Let me say this, and I'll be very candid about it. Okay, there has to be succession planning, and not just in terms of positions, but in terms of knowledge transfer. One of the things that I benefited from, and a number of people in my country have benefited from, was that older persons, also in the political system, knew that if the country had to continue to enjoy the gains that we've accrued over a number of years, and for the country and our institutions to do well, you have to pass on that knowledge, because that would then be a reflection of their legacy. If you were great and you didn't transfer that legacy, then when you're gone, is there a legacy? No. So what you do is that whilst you're there on the front line as the older generation, you have someone in the wings with you, learning as you go. And sometimes you push them forward and you see how they operate. Now, everything wouldn't be perfect, but you have to give them the opportunity. Young people are not just there, for election times, and then after that, for 4 or 5 years, um, you say to them, okay, go away. And that's one of the things that I must commend my leader, Prime Minister Motley, for having a very clear foresight of ensuring that young people participate in our economy, in our democracy, in our governance structures. And not just now she's Prime Minister. From 1994, under when we were in government before, she was our youngest Minister of Education, Youth and Sports in her 20s. So she understood from over 25 years ago how these things work and the importance of ensuring that young people are at the heart of our development. And let's be honest, young people bring a different perspective to things. Now, it doesn't mean that you only agitate for youth. And that's the big mistake sometimes that youth advocates do. You only agitate for youth. No, you treat to things, you deal with issues of the economy, trade, tourism, sports, infrastructure, health, politics from a youth perspective. There's a difference. Okay. And it forces us to then to read, to research, to engage, to analyze, and put forward comprehensive, sound positions that allows for our people to benefit. So I think there's a lot of growth in this, but equally sometimes through strategic ways, you have to also demand your presence. And by demand it, I don't mean go knocking on the door, let me in, but by your own very conduct, by your own independent approaches, people then see what you've done over time, and it allows for you to be in demand with what you would want from them. So I hope that makes it clear for you. Hello? I'm not sure if you can hear me anymore. Okay.
Sorry, I lost you there. My power went off. Apologies for that.
No,
That's
that's
one of the
fine. You know, one of the things they say, always say Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. These things happen. Just like the pandemic. You just have to expect it, prepare for it, and go from there.
Absolutely. So you were talking about succession plan. Please go ahead. Continue.
Yeah, so quite nicely, what I was saying is that succession planning has to be part of your legacy. And in order for there to be knowledge transfer and experience, if you want your legacy and the success that you've been able to achieve to go on, you have to ensure that people are there with you. So as you're going along as an older person, and by older, I don't mean in terms of age necessarily, but by experience, bring someone under your wings so that as you go forward, you have a situation where they learn from you. And you give them opportunity to grow. If they make a mistake, you give them counsel. But then you're ensuring that the legacy that you have started will continue. And I think that is the opportunity that many of our countries have missed. Some are grabbing it. As I was saying before you were cut off, my current Prime Minister, Prime Minister Motley, she was the Minister of Education, Youth, and Sports in 1994 in her 20s. She was a minister in the cabinet in her 20s, member of parliament. Then she moved on to be the attorney general, I think in her late 20s, early 30s. Then she became the deputy prime minister, etc. So the prime minister you see today is there partly because she was able to shine from a very long time. So if you give young people opportunities now, the sky is the limit, to borrow from that cliche. And I don't really like to use it much, but it's true. Young people have a lot of ideas to give, but equally, as I said, to whom much is given, much is expected, because many young people sometimes, and I'm saying this from experience of seeing it, are given opportunities. And then when they get there, they don't look back. They forget who they are seeking to represent or who look up to them. And they're not necessarily trying to bring everyone along. It's not about us. It's about everyone else. And that collective thinking has to take place. Simply now with the pandemic, I'm not wearing a mask for me. I'm wearing a mask for you. You know, so
Yes.
it's that sort of thing.
Ambassador, my second to the last question is, did you have any prior political appointment in your country before being sent to the UN? Why this is important is a lot of young people from my country need to also learn from this, because it's always perceived that because you've had no prior political experience, you may not be able to handle some post in politics, in particular in Africa. But we have exceptions like Uganda, where they have a very young parliament. We have Liberia, where they have young cabinet ministers and all of that. But big countries in Africa, I feel that you must have had some prior position before you were given a huge opportunity. Was this your first political appointment before being sent to the UN?
Invariably, yes. I've been involved in a number of different things throughout my life back in Barbados and across the world, from a volunteering perspective in many respects, from a professional perspective in many respects. But this is the first time that I am in a politically appointed position, as it were. And as I said, to have been able to been asked to do so at such a young age, at 35, is really humbling, but also a testament to, one, the visionary leadership of my leader, Prime Minister Motley, and two, for preparation. Preparation is key. I've spent most of my life in my late teens to as recent as 2 years ago, doing different things strategically to be able to build my capacity to be able to give to others. And that's why it's so important. And as I said before, you don't always get an opportunity by saying, oh, give me the opportunity. Sometimes you become the expert in a particular area. Make yourself an expert in a particular area and let that demand work for you. Then people come asking for you. So it's something that has to be balanced, but equally there is a role of deliberate strategy as well, that policymakers should and must, and I make this clarion call, bring young people on board, but not just young people. The disabled community, persons have a lot of ideas, but they're not necessarily always given the opportunity to do so. Okay, the inclusivity that I'm talking about now has to become a mainstay of how we go forward. That's also part of the sustainability argument as well. It's not just in terms of the environment, but are we using our resources to their maximum optimal use?
Yeah, Your Excellency, what advice do you have for young people who look up to you for inspiration, or young people across the globe who may want to follow your career path, who've heard your story and who are inspired by your story about your life and who may want to follow your career path or want to also work for the UN or work for international organizations and looking forward to such opportunity like this?
Excuse me. Well, I would simply say this: think big. First of all, think big. Think big. I can't say this enough. Think big. Second of all, believe in your ideas. You have to believe in them. Thirdly, and importantly, surround yourself with people who also have that drive of pushing you and you pushing them. One of the worst things that you possibly can do is to surround yourself by people who are not necessarily driven by the same motivation as you, or who, if you have an idea, they like to just throw cold water on it. No. Don't do that. Fourthly, very important, try to become an expert in whatever you're good at. So if you're doing something, if you're good in sports, public speaking, economics, business, music, fashion, whatever, set in your mind that you must, not may, must become the best at that. And once you do that, you will start to become the best at it. And when you start to become the best, that demand that I spoke about earlier will attract people towards you. People will then start to ask you to give engagements and speeches and do a number of different activities without you even having to ask for it. Because why? You've learned your craft, you're developing your craft, and you've shown to those externally that you're prepared to go to the next level. And when you get there, wherever there is the goal that you set, always look back and try to bring people along with you. One of the mistakes that we always do, when it goes back to the whole succession planning, is that when we arrive at a place of success, we close the door behind us and then think, okay, no, we have to bring each other. So for me, that would be the message that I would give to the young people who are listening to this. Stay focused, think big, surround yourself with people who think just as big or bigger than you, and be strategic. Work hard, become the best that you can in whatever area that you are in, and that will then bring that momentum for you. And never get stagnant. I always read. As much as I have a lot of knowledge, or I would like to think so, I don't know everything. I'm always reading, whether it be politics, business, sports, fashion, music, you name it, because it keeps your mind going. The world is changing. The technology today is not the technology tomorrow. Who would have predicted couple years ago, or if someone had said to you, Dayo, that BlackBerry would not be the same, or if at all, in 2020, you probably would have thought, no way, right?
No
we
way.
can't get complacent. I'm not saying that they got complacent, but the point I'm making is we have to always be ahead. What's next? How can I re-improve myself? How can I encourage you to re-improve yourself? And once you have that mindset, automatically, you will start to see the sort of successes, both in terms of your local neighborhoods and villages, communities, nationally, and as a continent. Honestly, as I said before, Africa has everything that the world needs, and you need to supply it as well. So if anyone has any questions for me, they're free to follow me on Twitter at Bajan Diplomat. That's spelled at BAJAN.
It's even on the screen.
Oh, it's on the screen. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At Bajan Diplomat is right on the screen.
Yes,
under his
Bajan
name.
Diplomat. Absolutely.
Right, yeah. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the wisdom that you've shared with us and for the thoughts that you've been able to share with us today. We're really inspired and we're challenged by your story and by your life and by your contribution to global economy. And we wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you very much. And same to you, and all the best with your show. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And to all our viewers who have watched today, we're very grateful that you've joined us to hear this insightful conversation with Ambassador Chad Blackman, the Ambassador of Barbados to the United Nations, to the World Trade Organization, and all other international organizations in Geneva, Switzerland. Thank you, Ambassador. We look forward to seeing all our guests again tomorrow, same time, and in all the various social platforms. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.